March 15, 2024. Atlanta Federal Courthouse erupted into chaos when decorated Delta Force operator Captain Maya Richardson was dragged out of a civil hearing in handcuffs after a judge accused her of contempt and disrespecting the court. Security guards hauled her toward a holding cell, while spectators recorded the humiliating arrest on their phones. But none of them knew what she had really been doing in that courtroom, or why her commanding officer was racing across 3 states to get there. What was Captain Richardson actually investigating that made a federal judge so desperate to silence her before the truth came out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Richard B. Russell Federal Building in downtown Atlanta hummed with its usual Tuesday morning activity as lawyers, defendants, and witnesses filtered through security checkpoints. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, while the echo of footsteps and muted conversations created a soundtrack of bureaucratic routine. Courtroom 7B on the 3rd floor was preparing for what appeared to be a standard civil asset forfeiture hearing, the kind of proceeding that typically attracted minimal attention from anyone beyond the parties directly involved. Captain Maya Richardson sat in the gallery's 3rd row, her posture reflecting years of military discipline despite her civilian attire. At 32 years old, she wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her natural hair pulled back in a professional bun that revealed the sharp angles of her face. Her dark eyes scanned the courtroom with the systematic attention of someone trained to notice details others overlooked. To the handful of people present, she appeared to be just another observer, perhaps a law student or journalist covering routine court proceedings. Judge Harold Brennan entered through the rear door of the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly as he climbed to the bench. At 63, Brennan had presided over the Northern District of Georgia for nearly 2 decades, building a reputation for efficiency and intolerance of what he deemed courtroom theaters. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, and his reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, ready to be deployed when needed for document review. The case before the court involved the seizure of properties and assets belonging to the Henderson family, local business owners who operated a chain of check-cashing stores throughout Atlanta's predominantly black neighborhoods. The federal government, represented by Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Dalton, claimed the businesses had been used to launder money for drug trafficking organizations. The Henderson family, represented by Public Defender Lisa Moreno, maintained their innocence and argued that law enforcement had targeted them without substantial evidence. Maya had been observing these proceedings for 3 days, taking meticulous notes in a leather journal that never left her possession. She had watched as witness after witness testified about suspicious cash transactions, about customers who visited multiple Henderson family financial services locations in single days, about record-keeping irregularities that prosecutors claimed demonstrated criminal intent. What troubled Maya was not what the witnesses said, but what they carefully avoided mentioning. Judge Brennan called the court to order, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton stood to call his next witness. Special Agent Dennis Crawford from the Drug Enforcement Administration took the stand, his credentials impressive enough to command immediate respect from anyone unfamiliar with the deeper context of his testimony. Crawford had been with the DEA for 16 years, participated in hundreds of investigations, and testified in federal court on numerous occasions. As Crawford began describing the evidence against the Henderson family, Maya noticed something that made her lean forward slightly in her seat. The agent was presenting surveillance photographs that she recognized from an entirely different investigation, one that had nothing to do with the Henderson businesses. The photos showed people entering and leaving locations that were nowhere near any Henderson family financial services branch, Yet Crawford was testifying that these images demonstrated the pattern of money laundering activity connected to the family's operations. Maya's hand moved to her phone, pulling up encrypted files that she had spent months compiling. The photographs Crawford was presenting to the court had been taken during Operation Copperwire, a multi-agency investigation into corrupt law enforcement officers who were actually facilitating drug trafficking rather than investigating it. Those photos showed meetings between DEA agents and cartel representatives, not innocent business owners and their customers. Someone had deliberately mislabeled the evidence and introduced it into this proceeding. Judge Brennan was nodding along as Crawford testified, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. Lisa Moreno, the public defender, appeared overwhelmed by the technical nature of the testimony and the sheer volume of evidence being presented. She made sporadic objections, most of which Brennan overruled with barely concealed impatience. The Henderson family members sat at the defense table looking defeated, as if they had already accepted that the outcome was predetermined regardless of the truth. Maya stood up abruptly, the movement drawing immediate attention in the quiet courtroom. Judge Brennan's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening at the interruption. Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton paused mid-sentence, confusion crossing his face. Agent Crawford looked directly at Maya for the first time, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been recognition or perhaps calculation. "Your Honor," Maya said, her voice carrying the command presence of someone accustomed to being heard in high-pressure situations, "I need to address the court regarding the testimony currently being presented."
Judge Brennan's face flushed red with immediate anger. "Young lady, I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but you will sit down immediately. This is a federal courtroom, not a public forum for random interruptions." Maya remained standing, her posture relaxed but unmovable. "Your Honor, my name is Captain Maya Richardson. I'm a military observer with relevant information about the evidence being presented to this court. The photographs Agent Crawford just introduced are not what he claims them to be." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Agent Crawford shifted uncomfortably on the witness stand. Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton stood up, objecting loudly to what he called an unprecedented and inappropriate interruption by someone with no standing in the case. Judge Brennan's hand came down on his bench with a sharp crack that made several people in the gallery jump. "Captain Richardson, if that's even your real name," Judge Brennan said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "you have approximately 5 seconds to sit down and remain silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom and charged with contempt." Maya's response was measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, I understand your concern about courtroom protocol. However, I have documentation that proves the evidence currently being presented is fraudulent. Agent Crawford is testifying about photographs that were actually taken during a completely different investigation, one that has nothing to do with the Henderson family." Judge Brennan's face went from red to nearly purple. "Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom immediately. She is in contempt of court." 2 court security officers moved toward Maya's row, their hands moving instinctively toward their equipment. Maya remained still, her hands visible and non-threatening, but she continued speaking with absolute clarity. "The photographs Agent Crawford identified as evidence of money laundering at Henderson Family Financial Services locations were actually taken in Valdosta, Georgia, during surveillance of DEA personnel meeting with known cartel operatives. I have the original case files with proper dates, locations, and context. This testimony constitutes perjury and evidence tampering in a federal proceeding." "That's enough," Judge Brennan roared, rising from his bench. "Bailiff, place this woman under arrest for criminal contempt. I want her taken into custody immediately." The security officers, now visibly uncertain about the situation they found themselves in, nevertheless followed their orders. They placed handcuffs on Maya's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the silent courtroom. Several people in the gallery had their phones out, recording the extraordinary scene.
Maya didn't resist, but her eyes never left Judge Brennan's face. "Your Honor, I strongly advise you to suspend this proceeding and contact the Department of Defense before you compound the federal offenses currently being committed in this courtroom." "Get her out of here," Judge Brennan snapped, but his voice lacked the commanding fury it had carried moments before. There was something else there now, something that might have been fear or perhaps the dawning realization that he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. As Maya was led from the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of the Henderson family members, their expressions transformed from resignation to confused hope. Lisa Moreno, the public defender, finally found her voice and stood up to object, arguing that if Maya had evidence of perjury, the court was obligated to review it before proceeding. Judge Brennan cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Miss Moreno, your client's interests are not served by encouraging disruptions in my courtroom. This woman has no credentials, no standing, and no authority to interrupt federal proceedings with wild accusations against a decorated DEA agent." Maya allowed the security officers to take her arms, but her voice remained steady and clear enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "Your Honor, I'm not making wild accusations. I'm a Delta Force operator conducting an authorized investigation into corruption within federal law enforcement agencies. The evidence being presented in this courtroom is fabricated, and I have documentation to prove it." Judge Brennan's hand trembled slightly as he pointed at Maya. "I don't care what you claim to be. You're disrupting a federal court proceeding and you're going into custody. Bailiff, take her away. Now." The security officers, now visibly uncertain about the situation they found themselves in, nevertheless followed their orders. They placed handcuffs on Maya's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the silent courtroom. Several people in the gallery had their phones out, recording the extraordinary scene. Maya didn't resist, but her eyes never left Judge Brennan's face. "Your Honor, I strongly advise you to suspend this proceeding and contact the Department of Defense before you compound the federal offenses currently being committed in this courtroom." "Get her out of here," Judge Brennan snapped, but his voice lacked the commanding fury it had carried moments before. There was something else there now, something that might have been fear or perhaps the dawning realization that he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. As Maya was led from the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of the Henderson family members, their expressions transformed from resignation to confused hope. Lisa Moreno, the public defender, finally found her voice and stood up to object, arguing that if Maya had evidence of perjury, the court was obligated to review it before proceeding. Judge Brennan cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Miss Moreno, your client's interests are not served by encouraging disruptions in my courtroom. This woman has no credentials, no standing, and no authority to interrupt federal proceedings with wild accusations against a decorated DEA agent." Maya allowed the security officers to take her arms, but her voice remained steady and clear enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "Your Honor, I'm not making wild accusations. I'm a Delta Force operator conducting an authorized investigation into corruption within federal law enforcement agencies. The evidence being presented in this courtroom is fabricated, and I have documentation to prove it." Judge Brennan's hand trembled slightly as he pointed at Maya. "I don't care what you claim to be. You're disrupting a federal court proceeding and you're going into custody. Bailiff, take her away. Now."
The security officers, now visibly uncertain about the situation they found themselves in, nevertheless followed their orders. They placed handcuffs on Maya's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the silent courtroom. Several people in the gallery had their phones out, recording the extraordinary scene. Maya didn't resist, but her eyes never left Judge Brennan's face. "Your Honor," Maya said as the officers began escorting her toward the side door, "I strongly advise you to suspend this proceeding and contact the Department of Defense before you compound the federal offenses currently being committed in this courtroom." "Get her out of here," Judge Brennan snapped, but his voice lacked the commanding fury it had carried moments before. There was something else there now, something that might have been fear, or perhaps the dawning realization that he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment.
As Maya was led from the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of the Henderson family members, their expressions transformed from resignation to confused hope. Lisa Moreno was frantically typing on her laptop, likely researching whether military personnel could actually conduct the kind of investigation Maya had described. Agent Crawford remained standing at the witness box, his face pale and his hands gripping the wooden rail in front of him.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The heavy door closed behind Maya and the security officers, cutting off the eruption of whispered conversations that filled Courtroom 7B. The officers led her down the hallway toward the building's detention area, their grip professional but not unnecessarily rough. They had no idea what they had just become part of, no understanding of the chain reaction that had been set in motion the moment Judge Brennan ordered the arrest of a Delta Force operator who had been trying to prevent a miscarriage of justice. In the detention processing area, Maya was fingerprinted and photographed, the routine procedures of booking carried out by personnel who handled dozens of contempt arrests each year. But this was not routine, and within the hour, the reverberations of what had just occurred in Courtroom 7B would reach offices in Washington, D.C. that Judge Brennan had never imagined would take an interest in his decisions. 300 miles away, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a secure phone line was about to ring in an office that belonged to someone who would not take kindly to learning that one of his operators had been arrested while conducting an authorized investigation into federal corruption. The message that would soon reach him would trigger a response that would turn a Tuesday morning contempt arrest into a national incident with implications reaching far beyond a single courtroom in Atlanta. Maya sat in the holding cell, her expression calm despite the circumstances. She had expected resistance when she revealed herself, but she had not anticipated the judge's extreme reaction or his willingness to proceed with her arrest even after learning her military status. That reaction told her something important. Judge Brennan was more deeply involved in the corruption than her investigation had initially suggested. An innocent judge might have been angry at the interruption, but would have at least paused to verify her credentials before proceeding. Brennan's immediate escalation suggested he had something significant to hide. The question now was how long it would take for her commander to be notified and what would happen when he arrived. Maya had full confidence in the legal authority behind her investigation, but she also understood that military-civilian jurisdictional conflicts could become complicated quickly. The next few hours would determine whether Operation Blind Justice continued as planned or became a legal and political nightmare that would require intervention from the highest levels of government. In Courtroom 7B, Judge Brennan had called a recess, retreating to his chambers while Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton and Agent Crawford held an urgent whispered conversation. The Henderson family and their attorney sat in confusion, uncertain whether what had just happened was good or bad for their case. And on multiple social media platforms, video clips of the arrest were beginning to circulate, tagged with phrases like, "Military officer arrested in federal court," and "Judge orders Delta Force captain detained." The story was only beginning to unfold, and none of the participants yet understood the full scope of what they had become involved in, or how this morning's events would ultimately reshape not just their individual lives, but the entire system of federal law enforcement oversight and accountability. 6 days before her arrest in Courtroom 7B, Captain Maya Richardson had been sitting in a secure briefing room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, reviewing classified intelligence reports that would change the trajectory of her military career. The room was soundproof and windowless, designed for discussions that could never leave its walls. Across the table sat Colonel Marcus Webb, her commanding officer and one of the highest-ranking African-American officers in Special Operations Command. Colonel Webb slid a thick manila folder across the polished conference table. "Maya, what I'm about to share with you doesn't officially exist. Operation Blind Justice was authorized 3 months ago by a joint task force including Defense Intelligence, FBI Internal Affairs, and the Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility. We have credible evidence that multiple federal judges and law enforcement personnel are deliberately targeting minority-owned businesses for asset forfeiture, then splitting the proceeds with corrupt agents who fabricate evidence to justify the seizures. Maya opened the folder, her eyes scanning financial records, surveillance logs, and intercepted communications that painted a disturbing picture of systematic corruption. The scope was far larger than any single case. Over 18 months, the task force had identified a network operating across 6 federal districts in the Southeast, generating an estimated $47 million through fraudulent asset seizures. Colonel Webb continued, his voice grave. We need someone who can infiltrate ongoing proceedings, verify the evidence fabrication in real time, and provide testimony that will hold up under the most intense legal scrutiny. You were selected because of your legal training at Yale, your investigative experience, and frankly because you fit the demographic profile that makes you invisible to these people until it's too late for them to cover their tracks. Maya had graduated from Yale Law School before joining the military, a path that had surprised her family but made perfect sense to her. She had spent her childhood in Newark, New Jersey, watching her father's small construction business get buried under regulatory obstacles that somehow never affected white-owned competitors. Her mother had been a paralegal who worked 60-hour weeks helping people navigate a legal system that seemed designed to defeat them. Maya had joined the military not despite her legal education, but because of it, believing that real justice sometimes required the kind of direct action that courtrooms could never provide. After law school, she had applied to Army Special Operations, enduring selection processes that washed out 90% of candidates. Her combination of legal expertise and tactical training made her uniquely valuable for operations that existed in the gray zone between military action and law enforcement. Delta Force operators were trained to function in hostile environments where traditional rules didn't apply, and Maya had proven herself in operations across 3 continents before being tapped for Operation Blind Justice. The specific case that brought her to Atlanta involved Judge Harold Brennan and a pattern of decisions that had devastated Black-owned businesses throughout Georgia. Over 5 years, Brennan had presided over 73 asset forfeiture cases, and 68 of them involved minority business owners. The mathematical improbability of that pattern had initially caught the attention of a statistics professor at Georgia State University, who ran the numbers and realized something was systematically wrong. Maya spent 3 days reviewing every detail of the Henderson family case. Thomas and Patricia Henderson had built their check-cashing business from a single storefront into a network of 11 locations serving communities that banks had abandoned. They employed 47 people, mostly local residents who had struggled to find work elsewhere. They paid their taxes, followed all state regulations, and maintained detailed records of every transaction. The DEA investigation that led to the asset forfeiture proceedings had been initiated by Agent Dennis Crawford, a 20-year veteran whose financial records showed deposits that his salary couldn't explain. Crawford had a history of working cases that resulted in major asset seizures, and internal DEA reviews had quietly noted concerns about his evidence-handling procedures. Those concerns had never resulted in formal investigations because Crawford had cultivated relationships with supervisors who protected him in exchange for their own shares of forfeiture proceeds. Maya's assignment was to observe the Henderson trial, document any evidence fabrication, and intervene only if she witnessed perjury or other criminal conduct that would compromise the proceedings. Her orders came with authority from the Secretary of Defense himself, granting her unusual latitude to operate within civilian legal spaces. The jurisdiction was legally complex, but the authorization was clear. Military personnel had standing to investigate federal crimes when those crimes threatened national security or constitutional rights on a systematic scale. The night before the trial began,
Maya had reviewed surveillance footage that showed Agent Crawford meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton at a restaurant in suburban Atlanta. The audio surveillance, authorized by a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court warrant due to the national security implications of systematic corruption, captured Crawford and Dalton discussing how to present evidence in the Henderson case to ensure conviction regardless of the facts. "We just need to make sure the judge sees enough to justify the forfeiture. Brennan knows what we need. He's been doing this for years. The Hendersons won't fight back because they can't afford lawyers who know how to challenge our procedures." Crawford had laughed, a sound that Maya found chilling in its casual cruelty. The beauty of going after these small business owners is that they always assume the system is legitimate. By the time they realize we're just stealing from them, it's too late to do anything about it. And even if they complain, who's going to believe them over federal agents and a federal judge?
That recording was now secured in military intelligence databases, backed up across multiple classified servers. Maya had listened to it a dozen times, memorizing every word and inflection. It was the kind of evidence that could destroy careers and send people to prison for decades, but only if it could be introduced properly in a legal context where it couldn't be challenged or suppressed. Maya's background had prepared her for this mission in ways that extended beyond military training. Growing up in Newark, she had watched her father fight a losing battle against a city inspector who demanded bribes to approve permits for his construction projects. Her father had refused to pay, believing that his honest work and proper documentation would protect him. Instead, he found himself buried under violations for minor infractions that white contractors routinely ignored. The business had eventually failed, and her father had died of a heart attack at 53, worn down by stress and the bitter knowledge that integrity had cost him everything. Her mother had been more pragmatic, teaching Maya that fighting corrupt systems required understanding how they operated from the inside. She had shown Maya case files where people with resources and knowledge had successfully challenged corrupt officials, and cases where people without those advantages had been crushed. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't automatic. It required power, knowledge, and the willingness to use both strategically. At Yale Law School, Maya had focused her studies on constitutional law and federal criminal procedure, writing her thesis on systematic civil rights violations in asset forfeiture cases. Her professors had praised the work's legal analysis, while privately expressing doubt that anyone would ever seriously address the problems she had identified. The legal system, they explained, was designed to protect itself from the kind of fundamental challenges her research suggested were necessary. That academic skepticism had solidified her decision to pursue military service rather than a traditional legal career. In special operations, she had found an organization that valued results over procedural niceties, that understood sometimes the mission required unconventional approaches, and that gave its personnel the training and authority to operate in environments where normal rules couldn't apply. Her operational deployments had taken her to places where corruption was open and expected rather than hidden behind legal formalities. She had seen how power operated when it didn't have to pretend to be legitimate, and that experience had given her insights into how American corruption functioned differently. In the United States, the corrupt didn't need to be obvious about their criminality because they could hide behind legitimate institutions that provided cover and plausible deniability. Colonel Webb had selected Maya for Operation Blind Justice specifically because she understood both sides of that equation. She could navigate courtrooms with the expertise of a Yale-trained lawyer, but she could also function in hostile environments with the skills of a Delta Force operator. The mission required someone who could gather evidence, testify credibly under pressure, and if necessary, defend herself if the targets of the investigation tried to eliminate the threat she represented.
The briefing at Fort Bragg had included threat assessments suggesting that the corruption network, if exposed, might resort to violence to protect itself. Maya had been authorized to carry concealed weapons even in federal facilities, a privilege granted under classified Defense Department directives that most law enforcement personnel didn't know existed. She had been given emergency contact protocols that could mobilize military assets if she found herself in immediate danger. As Maya had prepared to deploy to Atlanta, Colonel Webb had given her one final piece of guidance. "You're going to see things that make you angry," he had said. "You're going to watch innocent people get railroaded by a system that's supposed to protect them. Your job is not to save everyone. Your job is to document the systematic corruption so thoroughly that when we bring charges, there's no possibility of dismissal or acquittal. Stay focused on the mission, not on individual victims." But sitting in courtroom 7B and watching Agent Crawford commit perjury while Judge Brennan facilitated it had tested Maya's discipline. The Henderson family wasn't just a case file or a mission parameter. They were real people watching their life's work get stolen through a process that wore the costume of justice while serving the interests of criminals. When Crawford had introduced the fabricated photographs, Maya had faced a choice: follow her orders to simply document the crime, or intervene to prevent a miscarriage of justice that was unfolding in real time. She had chosen intervention, knowing it would compromise her cover and potentially complicate the larger investigation. But she had also calculated that Judge Brennan's reaction to her revelation would itself provide valuable evidence about the depth of his involvement. An honest judge who had been fooled by a corrupt agent would have paused the proceedings to investigate her claims. Brennan's immediate escalation to arrest suggested he was protecting the conspiracy, not just defending his courtroom authority. Now sitting in the federal building's holding cell, Maya reviewed her decision and concluded she had made the right call. The mission had evolved from passive observation to active intervention, and she had the authority and evidence to justify that evolution. What happened next would depend on how quickly her chain of command received notification of her arrest and how they chose to respond. In her pocket, concealed in a way that standard searches wouldn't detect, was a secure communication device that would activate automatically if she didn't check in within prescribed intervals. That device would send an emergency alert directly to Colonel Webb's operations center, triggering protocols that would bring the full weight of military and federal law enforcement resources to bear on the situation. Maya estimated she had approximately 2 hours before those protocols kicked in, 2 hours during which Judge Brennan, Agent Crawford, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton would have to decide how to respond to the crisis she had created. Would they try to suppress evidence of her military status? Would they attempt to proceed with contempt charges despite the obvious jurisdictional problems? Or would they recognize that they had just committed federal offenses against a military officer conducting an authorized investigation and try to negotiate some kind of resolution? The answers to those questions would reveal just how deep the corruption ran and how confident the conspirators were in their protection from consequences. Maya was betting they would make the wrong choices, and every wrong choice would provide additional evidence for the prosecution cases that were already being prepared in Washington. Outside the holding cell, decisions were being made that would set in motion a chain of events none of the participants fully understood. Judge Brennan was making phone calls to people he believed could protect him. Agent Crawford was contacting his superiors at the DEA to report a situation that threatened to expose activities that went far beyond Atlanta. And Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton was frantically researching whether a military officer could actually conduct the kind of investigation Maya had described, and what the consequences might be if her claims proved legitimate. None of them yet understood that they were no longer in control of the situation, that their actions were being monitored in real time by intelligence personnel who were documenting every phone call and every attempt at cover-up. The trap had been set months ago, and Maya's arrest was not a setback to the investigation, rather its culmination. The question now was not whether the corruption would be exposed, but how many people would be implicated when the full scope of Operation Blind Justice became public. And that answer depended on choices that were being made in the next few hours by people who still believed they could control a situation that had already spiraled far beyond their ability to manage. Colonel Harold Webb's chambers occupied a corner suite on the 4th floor of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, with windows overlooking downtown Atlanta skyline. The mahogany furniture and leather-bound law books projected an image of judicial gravitas that Brennan had carefully cultivated over 19 years on the federal bench. Framed photographs lined one wall showing him shaking hands with senators, speaking at bar association events, and receiving various legal honors that marked his ascent through Georgia's legal establishment.
Brennan had been appointed to the federal bench during a previous administration, recommended by senators who valued his reputation as a prosecutor who understood the importance of being tough on crime. His confirmation hearing had been unremarkable, with only routine questions about his judicial philosophy and no serious opposition from civil rights organizations who would later come to regret their silence. He had presented himself as a moderate conservative committed to following the law wherever it led, and the Senate had confirmed him with minimal debate. The reality behind that carefully constructed image was far more complicated. Brennan came from old Georgia money, the kind of wealth that had survived Sherman's march and adapted to each subsequent era by learning how to profit from whatever system emerged. His grandfather had been a banker who helped wealthy white families protect their assets during integration. His father had been a real estate developer who pioneered legal techniques for maintaining segregated neighborhoods long after such discrimination was officially prohibited. Brennan himself had attended the University of Georgia School of Law, where he joined organizations that recruited from families like his, families that understood wealth preservation as a generational project requiring careful attention to legal loopholes and political relationships. After law school, he spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor, building a record of convictions that emphasized quantity over quality of justice. He learned which cases attracted positive media attention and which defendants lacked resources to mount effective defenses. His appointment to the bench had been the culmination of decades of networking within Georgia's legal and political circles. He joined the right clubs, attended the right churches, and cultivated relationships with powerful people who could advance his career. He understood instinctively that success in his world required appearing respectable while quietly serving the interests of people who preferred operating behind legitimate facades. The asset forfeiture program had been Brennan's particular specialty for nearly a decade. Federal law allowed seizure of property connected to criminal activity, and theoretically, those seizures required proof of actual crimes. But in practice, the standards were low enough that aggressive prosecutors could seize assets first and force owners to prove their innocence later, reversing the normal burden of proof. The process was lucrative for law enforcement agencies that received portions of seized assets, creating incentives for aggressive interpretation of already permissive laws. Brennan had recognized early that asset forfeiture cases offered opportunities beyond their official purposes. Small business owners, particularly minority owners in marginalized communities, made perfect targets because they often operated cash-intensive businesses that could be portrayed as suspicious. They rarely had resources for sophisticated legal defenses, and juries drawn from more affluent areas tended to view them with suspicion amplified by racial bias. Most importantly, they could be destroyed financially before they ever got meaningful opportunities to defend themselves.
The network Brennan helped coordinate included prosecutors who identified promising targets, agents who fabricated or embellished evidence to justify seizures, and other judges who could be counted on to rule favorably if cases happened to land in their courtrooms. The proceeds flowed through complex channels that appeared legitimate on surface examination, involving law enforcement equipment purchases, consulting contracts, and charitable foundations that provided cover for personal enrichment. Agent Dennis Crawford had become one of Brennan's most reliable partners in this enterprise. Crawford had joined the DEA with genuine intentions to fight drug trafficking, but 15 years of bureaucratic frustrations and watching less capable colleagues get promoted ahead of him had eroded whatever idealism he once possessed. When Brennan had first approached him through an intermediary about opportunities to supplement his government salary, Crawford had been receptive to conversations that might have troubled a more principled agent. Crawford's role was straightforward but crucial. He identified businesses that appeared vulnerable, initiated investigations that generated paperwork suggesting criminal activity, and testified in ways that judges like Brennan could cite to justify forfeitures. He had learned to present evidence with enough technical complexity that defense attorneys struggled to challenge him effectively, and he cultivated a professional demeanor that made juries trust his conclusions even when his reasoning was fundamentally dishonest. Over 8 years, Crawford had participated in 43 asset forfeiture cases that generated approximately $31 million in seized property. His share, laundered through consulting payments from a security company that existed primarily on paper, totaled just under $2 million. He had used those funds to purchase a lake house in North Carolina, pay for his children's private school education, and maintain a lifestyle that would have been impossible on his federal salary. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Dalton represented the third key element in the network's operations. At 41, Dalton had spent his entire legal career in the U.S. Attorney's Office, rising to supervise the Asset Forfeiture Division through a combination of aggressive prosecution statistics and careful political positioning. He understood that success in federal prosecution required maintaining conviction rates that impressed supervisors while avoiding cases that might attract unwanted scrutiny from appellate courts or media organizations. Dalton's background differed from Brennan's privileged upbringing. He had grown up in suburban Atlanta in a middle-class family, worked his way through Georgia State University, and graduated from Emory Law School with significant student debt. His entry into the corruption network had been gradual rather than ideological, beginning with small compromises that seemed justified by the pressures of conviction quotas and budget constraints. By the time he recognized he had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, he was too deeply implicated to extract himself without facing criminal exposure. The ecosystem these three men operated within extended far beyond their individual roles. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta employed over 100 prosecutors, most of whom were honest lawyers doing difficult work in an overwhelmed system. But that honest majority created cover for the corrupt minority because observers assumed that problematic cases represented individual errors rather than systemic corruption. When defense attorneys complained about fabricated evidence or procedural irregularities, supervisors attributed those complaints to defendants trying to avoid accountability rather than prosecutors abusing their authority. The DEA's Atlanta field office similarly housed mostly dedicated agents who believed in their mission and followed proper procedures. Crawford's reputation as a productive agent who closed cases efficiently made his supervisors reluctant to examine his methods too carefully. When internal reviews noted concerns about his evidence handling, supervisors prioritized maintaining conviction statistics over investigating potential misconduct. The institutional culture valued results over procedural integrity, creating environments where corruption could flourish as long as it produced impressive numbers. Federal judges operated within their own institutional culture that emphasized independence and deference to judicial authority. Other judges in the Northern District of Georgia had occasionally questioned Brennan's patterns in asset forfeiture cases,
But the tradition of not publicly criticizing fellow judges prevented those concerns from becoming formal complaints. The Judicial Council that oversaw judicial conduct consisted largely of judges who had known Brennan for decades and were predisposed to accept his explanations for decisions that might otherwise appear suspicious. This network of institutional protection had functioned smoothly for years because each participant understood their role and the unspoken rules that governed their cooperation. Prosecutors brought cases to judges who would rule favorably. Agents provided testimony that prosecutors could use to build technically adequate records, and judges issued rulings that appeared legally sound while serving the network's interests. And everyone maintained plausible deniability by ensuring that the corruption remained hidden behind legitimate procedures and professional rhetoric. The Henderson family case had been selected specifically because it appeared to present minimal risk of complications. The Hendersons were small business owners without sophisticated legal representation or political connections. Their businesses operated in predominantly black neighborhoods that received minimal media attention. The evidence Crawford had assembled, though fabricated, appeared sufficiently technical that few observers would scrutinize it carefully. Everything about the case suggested it would proceed to a favorable conclusion without attracting problematic attention. But what none of them had anticipated was that their activities had been under military intelligence surveillance for months, or that the unassuming observer in Courtroom 7B possessed both the expertise to recognize their evidence fabrication and the authority to intervene in ways that civilian observers could not. Their confidence in their institutional protection had made them careless, and that carelessness was about to cost them everything they had spent years building.
In his chambers following Maya's arrest, Brennan made a series of phone calls to people he believed could manage the crisis. He contacted the U.S. Attorney himself, describing Maya as a disturbed individual who had disrupted court proceedings with wild accusations. He called contacts in the federal judiciary who he hoped might provide advice about handling the situation. He even reached out to a senator's chief of staff who owed him favors from previous political campaigns. What Brennan didn't realize was that each of those phone calls was being recorded by intelligence personnel who were documenting his attempts to obstruct the investigation. His confidence that his network would protect him was about to collide with a reality he had never been forced to confront, that his institutional authority only extended as far as the system chose to honor it, and that system was about to turn against him with devastating force. The holding cell area beneath the Richard B. Russell Federal Building had been designed to process defendants briefly before moving them to more permanent detention facilities. Maya sat on the metal bench, her hands now free of handcuffs, listening to the muffled sounds of activity beyond the secured door. The court security officers who had processed her booking stood outside her cell, conferring in low voices that suggested growing uncertainty about the situation they found themselves managing. Officer Benjamin Turner, a 15-year veteran of federal court security, kept glancing at the paperwork in his hands with an expression that revealed increasing discomfort. He had processed hundreds of contempt arrests during his career, but none involving someone who claimed military special operations credentials. His partner, Officer Jessica Ramirez, was on her phone, attempting to verify Maya's identity through channels that were proving unexpectedly complicated. Upstairs in Courtroom 7B, the recess Judge Brennan had called showed no signs of ending. The Henderson family remained seated with their attorney, Lisa Moreno, who was frantically researching legal precedents for military intervention in civilian proceedings. Her laptop screen displayed multiple browser tabs covering topics she had never encountered in law school: military jurisdiction over federal crimes, Defense Department investigative authority, and the complex intersection of military and civilian legal systems. Thomas Henderson leaned toward his wife, Patricia, speaking in a whisper that carried hope for the first time in weeks. "Do you think that woman was telling the truth? Could the government really have been framing us this whole time?" Patricia's expression mixed skepticism with desperate optimism. "I don't know what to believe anymore. But did you see how that judge reacted when she said she was Delta Force? He looked terrified. Agent Dennis Crawford remained in the witness box, technically still under oath, but effectively frozen by the crisis unfolding around him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Dalton stood near the prosecution table, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with his supervisor at the main U.S. Attorney's office. The conversation was not going well based on the deepening lines of worry etched across his face. Several spectators who had been present for Maya's arrest remained in the courtroom, their phones capturing every moment and uploading clips to social media platforms where the story was beginning to gain viral traction. The hashtag military court arrest was trending in Atlanta, with thousands of people sharing videos and demanding explanations for what they had witnessed. Judge Brennan's chambers had become a command center for attempted damage control. He sat behind his desk with his jacket removed and his collar loosened, looking far less composed than the authoritative figure who had presided over the morning's proceedings. His law clerk, a recent Harvard graduate named Amanda Phillips, stood nearby with her own phone, relaying information she was receiving from contacts in other chambers. "Your Honor," Amanda said carefully, "I'm hearing from Judge Morrison's clerk that the U.S. Marshals Service just received an inquiry from the Department of Defense asking about the detention of Captain Maya Richardson. They're requesting immediate confirmation of her location and status." Brennan's face went pale. "What did the Marshals tell them?" "They confirmed she's in our facility's holding area. Judge, I think we need to consider that her credentials might be legitimate." Before Brennan could respond, his desk phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from the building's security command center. He answered, listened for 30 seconds while his expression shifted from concern to something approaching panic, then slowly replaced the receiver. "There are 2 officers from Fort Bragg Military Police in the building's lobby," he said quietly. "They're requesting access to speak with Captain Richardson, and they have orders from U.S. Special Operations Command." Amanda's eyes widened. "Your Honor, I strongly recommend you consult with the Chief Judge before this goes any further. If she really is who she claims to be, and if she was conducting an authorized investigation, then arresting her could constitute obstruction of a federal investigation and possibly violation of military law." The implications of Amanda's assessment hung in the air like a physical presence. Brennan had spent his career operating within a system where his authority was largely unquestioned, where defense attorneys had limited resources to challenge his decisions, and where institutional loyalty protected judges from consequences of questionable rulings. Now he faced the possibility that he had arrested a federal agent whose authority superseded his own, in front of witnesses whose recordings were already spreading across social media platforms. In the U.S. Attorney's main office across town, an emergency meeting was convening with senior prosecutors trying to assess the scope of the crisis. The U.S. Attorney himself, Gregory Sutton, sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by his top deputies. On a secure video link, representatives from the Department of Justice in Washington were demanding explanations for how a military investigation into corruption had apparently reached the point of dramatic courtroom confrontation without their knowledge. Robert Dalton stood before this assembly, attempting to explain the morning's events while minimizing his own role in whatever irregularities might be uncovered. His explanations were not landing well, particularly when he acknowledged that he had been working with Agent Crawford on the Henderson case for several months without ever questioning the evidence sources or methodology. Back in the holding area, the arrival of the military police officers had created a jurisdictional standoff that nobody seemed certain how to resolve. Captain James Mitchell and Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, both military police investigators from Fort Bragg, presented credentials and orders to the federal court security personnel that clearly authorized them to make contact with Captain Richardson. But the security officers had their own protocols, requiring authorization from federal court officials before releasing anyone from custody. Officer Turner made the decision to contact the Chief Judge directly rather than continuing to rely on Judge Brennan's authority. Chief Judge Patricia Holloway had been on the federal bench for 23 years and had a reputation for careful navigation of complex legal situations. Her chambers received Turner's call while she was reviewing appellate briefs, and his explanation of the situation brought her immediately to the building's detention area. Chief Judge Holloway was a dignified African-American woman in her early 60s who had broken multiple barriers during her career, becoming the first Black woman appointed to Georgia's federal bench. She had watched Judge Brennan's asset forfeiture decisions with growing concern over the years, noting statistical patterns that suggested potential bias but lacking concrete evidence to justify formal intervention. Now she found herself facing a situation that might finally provide that evidence. She approached Maya's holding cell with Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Rodriguez accompanying her. "Captain Richardson, I'm Chief Judge Patricia Holloway. I need to verify your identity and the nature of your activities in Judge Brennan's courtroom this morning." Maya stood, her military bearing evident despite the circumstances. "Your Honor, my credentials are in my portfolio, which was taken during booking. I'm a captain in the United States Army, assigned to the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. I was conducting surveillance on the Henderson asset forfeiture case as part of Operation Blind Justice, a joint military federal investigation into systematic corruption in civil asset forfeiture proceedings." Chief Judge Holloway turned to Captain Mitchell. "Can you verify this officer's identity and authorization?"
Captain Mitchell produced a tablet containing secured military databases. After a brief verification process, he confirmed Maya's identity, rank, and assignment. He then displayed orders signed by a 2-star general at Special Operations Command, authorizing Captain Richardson to conduct investigations into federal corruption cases and to intervene if she witnessed active criminal conduct in judicial proceedings. The Chief Judge studied the authorization documents with the careful attention of someone who understood she was looking at materials that would fundamentally alter her courthouse's operations. "These appear legitimate," she said, finally. "Captain Richardson, you're alleging that evidence presented in Judge Brennan's courtroom today was fabricated?" Maya nodded. Specifically, Agent Crawford testified about surveillance photographs that he claimed showed money laundering activities at Henderson Family Financial Services locations. Those photographs were actually taken during a separate DEA investigation in Valdosta, Georgia, and have no connection to the Henderson family. I have the original case files proving the photographs were deliberately mislabeled and introduced as false evidence. Chief Judge Holloway's expression revealed the gravity of Maya's allegations sinking in. "If that's accurate, we're looking at perjury, evidence tampering, and potentially obstruction of justice. Do you have documentation to support these claims?" "It's in my portfolio, along with encrypted files containing recordings of conversations between Judge Brennan, Agent Crawford, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton discussing fabrication of evidence in the Henderson case and other asset forfeiture proceedings." The Chief Judge turned to Officer Turner. "Release Captain Richardson immediately and return all her property. Then I want Judge Brennan and all parties involved in the Henderson case in the main ceremonial courtroom in 1 hour." She looked back at Maya. "Captain, I assume you'll want to make contact with your command structure." "Yes, Your Honor," Maya replied, "and I'll need to coordinate with federal prosecutors who are already prepared to bring charges related to this investigation." Chief Judge Holloway's next words carried the weight of someone who had just watched her courthouse's reputation collapse in real time. "I think we're past the point where this can be handled quietly. Captain Mitchell, you'll want to notify your chain of command that we have a major federal corruption case that's about to break wide open, and everyone involved needs to understand that what happens in the next few hours will determine whether this institution maintains any credibility or public trust." The pieces were falling into place exactly as Operation Blind Justice had been designed to force them to fall, and Judge Brennan's attempt to suppress the truth through his authority had instead accelerated the investigation's timeline in ways that would make concealment or cover-up impossible. The ceremonial courtroom of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building was normally reserved for naturalization ceremonies and special proceedings that required extra space for public attendance. Its wood-paneled walls and elevated gallery seating gave it an atmosphere of formality that exceeded even the regular courtrooms. Today, it was being pressed into service for what Chief Judge Patricia Holloway understood would be one of the most consequential proceedings in the courthouse's history. Maya stood near the prosecution table, now wearing her military uniform that Captain Mitchell had brought from Fort Bragg. The transformation from civilian observer to Army officer was complete and dramatic. Her uniform displayed the insignia of her rank, her Ranger tab, Special Forces tab, and the distinctive combat patches that indicated deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. The uniform sent an unmistakable message about who she was and what authorities stood behind her presence. Judge Brennan entered the ceremonial courtroom looking diminished compared to the confident figure who had ordered Maya's arrest hours earlier. His attorney, a criminal defense specialist named Victor Hayes, whom he had retained within the past hour, walked beside him with the grim expression of someone who had quickly assessed his client's legal exposure and found it catastrophic. They took seats at one of the defense tables, a positioning that itself signaled the reversal of power dynamics that had occurred. Agent Dennis Crawford sat at a separate table with his own attorney, a DEA lawyer named Catherine Perry, who specialized in defending agents from internal investigations. Crawford's normally confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone watching their career and freedom disappearing in real time. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Dalton occupied yet another table, flanked by two Justice Department attorneys from Washington who had arrived on an emergency flight to contain what was rapidly becoming a national scandal. The Henderson family sat in the gallery with their attorney Lisa Marino, their expressions mixing confusion with cautious optimism as they tried to comprehend how their asset forfeiture case had transformed into a federal corruption investigation. Other spectators included courthouse personnel, journalists who had caught wind of the extraordinary proceedings, and several federal prosecutors who wanted to witness firsthand what was happening to their colleagues. Chief Judge Holloway took her seat at the bench, her presence commanding immediate silence. Before we begin, I want to make clear that what we're discussing today involves potential criminal conduct by officers of this court and federal law enforcement personnel. Everything said here is being recorded and transcribed. Anyone who makes false statements will face perjury charges in addition to any other offenses that may be charged. She turned to Maya. Captain Richardson, you have the floor. Please explain for the record the nature of Operation Blind Justice and what you observed in Judge Brennan's courtroom this morning. Maya stepped forward, her military bearing evident in every movement. 3 months ago, a joint task force, including Defense Intelligence Agency, FBI Internal Affairs, and the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, initiated Operation Blind Justice to investigate systematic corruption in federal asset forfeiture proceedings. The investigation was authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense and Justice Department due to evidence suggesting that civil rights violations in forfeiture cases had reached a scale that threatened national security by undermining public trust in federal institutions. She activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's display screens, bringing up documentation that she had been prepared to introduce if the investigation had proceeded according to original timelines. The screen showed organizational charts mapping relationships between judges, prosecutors, and agents across 6 federal districts in the Southeast. Our investigation identified Judge Harold Brennan as a central figure in a network that deliberately targeted minority-owned businesses for forfeiture, then fabricated or manipulated evidence to justify seizures. Over 5 years, Judge Brennan presided over 73 asset forfeiture cases, with 68 involving minority business owners. Statistical analysis showed this pattern had less than 1% probability of occurring randomly. Judge Brennan's attorney stood. "Your Honor, I object to these allegations. My client has not been charged with any crime, and this proceeding lacks proper legal foundation." Chief Judge Holloway's response was sharp. "Mr. Hayes, your client ordered the arrest of a federal agent conducting an authorized investigation. That alone provides the foundation for these proceedings." Captain Richardson, please continue. Maya advanced to the next screen, showing financial records. Judge Brennan received payments totaling approximately $1.4 million over 5 years through consulting contracts with a security firm called Homeland Protection Consulting. This company exists primarily on paper and has no legitimate business operations. Its primary function appears to be laundering proceeds from asset forfeitures back to network participants. The display shifted to show Agent Crawford's financial records. Agent Dennis Crawford received similar payments totaling just under $2 million. His role was to initiate DEA investigations targeting businesses identified by the network, fabricate evidence supporting forfeiture actions, and provide testimony in proceedings before judges like Brennan who would ensure favorable rulings. Crawford's attorney objected, arguing that financial records alone didn't prove criminal conduct. Maya responded by playing audio recordings from the restaurant surveillance that had captured Crawford and Dalton discussing evidence fabrication. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as the voices clearly identified as Crawford and Dalton casually discussed manipulating evidence and coordinating with Judge Brennan to ensure convictions regardless of actual facts. "This morning in courtroom 7B, Maya continued, I observed Agent Crawford commit perjury by presenting surveillance photographs as evidence of money laundering at Henderson Family Financial Services locations. Those photographs were actually taken during a separate DEA investigation in Valdosta, Georgia, and have no connection to the Henderson family. I have the original case files proving the photographs were deliberately mislabeled and introduced as false evidence."
She displayed side-by-side comparisons of the photographs Crawford had presented and the original case files showing their true source. The metadata, location data, and case numbers made the fabrication undeniable. Several people in the gallery gasped as they realized they were looking at documentary proof of systematic evidence manipulation. When I attempted to inform the court of this perjury, Judge Brennan immediately ordered my arrest without reviewing any documentation or verifying my credentials. This response suggests Judge Brennan was not simply a judge who had been deceived by a corrupt agent, but rather an active participant protecting the conspiracy from exposure. Judge Brennan's face had gone from pale to gray as the evidence mounted against him. His attorney was furiously taking notes, likely calculating what kind of plea agreement might be negotiable, given the overwhelming documentation of criminal conduct. Maya continued presenting evidence for 40 minutes, methodically building a case that demonstrated systematic corruption involving not just Brennan, Crawford, and Dalton, but dozens of other participants across multiple states. She presented evidence of judges trading favorable rulings for payments, agents fabricating evidence in cases they knew were baseless, and prosecutors suppressing exculpatory evidence to maintain conviction rates that justified their career advancement. The scope expanded beyond financial corruption to reveal devastating impacts on families and communities. The Henderson family was just one of hundreds who had lost businesses, homes, and savings to a network that used legitimate legal processes as weapons of theft. Young entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses despite systemic obstacles found their life's work seized based on fabricated accusations they lacked resources to defend against. Communities already struggling with disinvestment lost businesses that provided employment and services, while the proceeds enriched corrupt officials. As Maya presented evidence about other victims, Thomas Henderson stood in the gallery, tears streaming down his face. "My father worked 3 jobs to help me start that first check-cashing store. We employed people from our neighborhood who couldn't get hired anywhere else. And these people destroyed it all just to steal from us. Chief Judge Holloway allowed him to speak, recognizing that the human cost of the corruption needed to be part of the record. The courtroom heard from other victims who had traveled to Atlanta after learning about the proceedings through social media, each telling stories of lives destroyed by a system that had betrayed its fundamental purpose. Maya's presentation concluded with evidence that Judge Brennan had made phone calls following her arrest, attempting to coordinate cover-up activities with other network participants. Those calls, all recorded by intelligence personnel monitoring the investigation, demonstrated consciousness of guilt and active obstruction even after being exposed. Your Honor, Maya said in conclusion, I recommend that Judge Brennan, Agent Crawford, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Dalton be taken into federal custody immediately, pending formal charges. I further recommend that all asset forfeiture cases these individuals have been involved with be reviewed for evidence of similar misconduct, and that victims be provided opportunities for restitution and restoration of seized property. Chief Judge Holloway sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what she had heard evident in her expression. Then she turned to the U.S. Marshals who had been present throughout the proceedings. Take Judge Brennan, Agent Crawford, and Mr. Dalton into custody. They are to be held pending arraignment on federal corruption charges. The arrest of a federal judge in his own courthouse created a scene that would dominate news coverage for weeks. As marshals placed handcuffs on Judge Brennan, cameras captured the moment when someone who had wielded power over countless lives faced accountability for how he had abused that power. Agent Crawford appeared to be in shock, unable to process that his career was ending not in retirement, but in federal detention. Robert Dalton put his head in his hands, the reality of his situation finally overwhelming his attempts at composure. Maya watched these arrests with professional detachment, knowing this was only the beginning of a much larger process that would unfold over months and years. But for now, justice had taken a critical step forward, and the system that had been corrupted was beginning the painful process of holding its own members accountable. Within hours of the arrests in Atlanta's federal courthouse, FBI field offices across 6 southeastern states executed coordinated raids that had been planned for weeks but accelerated by the dramatic public exposure of the corruption network. Teams of federal agents descended on law offices, courthouse chambers, and private residences, armed with warrants authorizing seizure of financial records, communications devices, and any evidence related to systematic asset forfeiture fraud. In Birmingham, Alabama, Federal District Judge William Patterson was meeting with his financial advisor when agents arrived at his downtown office. Patterson had presided over 32 suspicious asset forfeiture cases over 3 years, and his bank accounts showed deposits from the same shell company that had paid Judge Brennan. His attempts to claim the payments were legitimate consulting fees collapsed when agents presented him with recorded conversations discussing specific cases and how rulings should be structured to avoid appellate scrutiny. Charlotte, North Carolina became another focal point when DEA agent Marcus Freeman was arrested at his home while attempting to destroy computer hard drives containing case files that documented evidence fabrication. Freeman had worked closely with Agent Crawford, using similar techniques to mislabel surveillance materials and manufacture probable cause for investigations targeting businesses identified by the network. His panic destruction efforts came too late, as cloud backups and server archives had already been secured by FBI cybercrime specialists. The scope of documentary evidence recovered from these raids exceeded even the estimates that had prompted Operation Blind Justice. Prosecutors found spreadsheets tracking hundreds of asset forfeiture cases with notations indicating which judges were reliable partners and which required additional pressure. Email chains revealed discussions about dividing proceeds and coordinating testimony to ensure consistent narratives across multiple trials. Text messages showed network participants celebrating successful seizures and joking about victims who lacked resources to mount effective legal challenges. Colonel Marcus Webb arrived in Atlanta on a military transport aircraft, accompanied by senior officers from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, who specialized in the complex intersection of military and civilian legal authority. He met with Maya in a secured conference room at the FBI's Atlanta field office, reviewing the sequence of events that had led to her arrest and the subsequent exposure of the network. Captain Richardson, your decision to intervene when you witnessed perjury was technically outside your operational parameters, but given the circumstances, I'm classifying it as justified by exigent circumstances. Your actions prevented a miscarriage of justice and forced the network to reveal itself more completely than passive surveillance could have achieved. Maya appreciated the commander's support while understanding the complexity of what had occurred. Sir, I recognize that revealing myself would compromise the covert aspects of the investigation, but allowing fabricated evidence to result in conviction seemed contrary to the operation's ultimate objectives. The network's response to exposure provided valuable intelligence about their confidence levels and institutional protection mechanisms. The Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility dispatched its most senior investigators to coordinate what had become the largest prosecution of judicial corruption in modern American history. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Rachel Kim established a command center in Atlanta that brought together prosecutors from multiple U.S. attorney offices, FBI specialists in public corruption cases, and forensic accountants who began tracing financial flows through the network's complex laundering operations. She held daily briefings that were attended by representatives from congressional oversight committees who recognized the political implications of systematic corruption in federal courts. The evidence suggested that asset forfeiture abuse had been far more extensive than previous investigations had revealed, affecting thousands of families and generating hundreds of millions of illegally seized assets over nearly a decade.
Media coverage expanded beyond initial viral videos of Maya's arrest to comprehensive investigations into how the corruption had flourished undetected for so long. Major newspapers assigned investigative teams to review asset forfeiture patterns across federal districts, revealing statistical anomalies that should have triggered oversight mechanisms but had been ignored or rationalized. Television networks produced special reports featuring families whose businesses had been destroyed, giving human faces to what might otherwise have remained an abstract legal scandal. The Henderson family became central figures in this narrative, their case representing hundreds of others who had suffered similar injustices. Thomas and Patricia Henderson gave interviews describing how they had watched their life's work disappear into a legal process they couldn't afford to challenge effectively. Their employees shared stories about losing jobs when the businesses were seized, about struggles to support families after the network destroyed their employers' operations. Defense attorneys across the Southeast began filing motions for new trials in asset forfeiture cases involving any of the network participants. Public defenders who had felt helpless watching their clients lose property based on questionable evidence now had grounds to challenge those seizures. The legal system faced the massive task of reviewing potentially thousands of cases to determine which had been compromised by corrupt officials. Chief Judge Patricia Holloway appointed a special master to oversee this review process, selecting retired Supreme Court Justice Margaret Chen, whose reputation for integrity was unquestioned. Justice Chen established protocols for expedited review of cases where evidence suggested corruption, prioritizing families who had lost homes or businesses and needed urgent relief. Thomas Henderson's check-cashing stores were among the first properties ordered returned, with additional compensation for the months of lost business while the forfeiture had been pending. The family's reunion with their employees, who had been unemployed since the seizure, created emotional scenes that media outlets covered extensively, illustrating the real-world impact of official corruption beyond abstract legal principles. Financial restitution became a complex undertaking as prosecutors attempted to trace assets through networks of shell companies and offshore accounts.
Forensic accountants discovered that corrupt officials had been far more sophisticated in hiding their proceeds than initial investigations had suggested. Some payments had been laundered through legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal transactions. Other funds had been converted to cryptocurrency or precious metals that were difficult to track through traditional banking oversight. The investigation revealed that Homeland Protection Consulting, the shell company that had paid Judge Brennan and Agent Crawford, was itself owned by a network of subsidiary companies registered in states with minimal corporate transparency requirements. Unraveling these ownership structures required cooperation from state authorities who had previously paid little attention to how their corporate registration systems were being exploited for money laundering. International dimensions emerged when investigators discovered that some seized assets had been sold to buyers in foreign countries, with proceeds deposited in overseas accounts beyond easy reach of U.S. law enforcement. Recovery efforts required diplomatic negotiations and mutual legal assistance treaties that added months to the restitution timeline. Victims who had lost property faced frustrating delays while prosecutors worked through bureaucratic processes designed to protect legitimate international commerce, but which also complicated recovery of stolen assets. Congressional hearings began within weeks of the arrests, with House and Senate committees demanding explanations for how federal oversight mechanisms had failed to detect systematic corruption. Justice Department officials faced harsh questioning about why internal reviews had not identified the statistical anomalies in asset forfeiture patterns. Federal judiciary representatives struggled to explain why complaints about Judge Brennan and others had been dismissed or ignored despite evidence suggesting serious misconduct. These hearings produced commitments to reform that went beyond prosecuting individual corrupt officials. Legislators introduced bills requiring public databases of asset forfeiture cases, mandatory statistical analysis of judicial decision patterns, and independent review boards with authority to investigate judges without requiring permission from judicial councils that had proven ineffective at self-policing. Maya testified before both House and Senate committees, her military uniform lending additional credibility to her accounts of institutional failures that had enabled corruption. Her testimony was measured and professional, focusing on systematic problems rather than individual villains, but clearly establishing that the corruption had been possible because oversight mechanisms were designed to protect officials rather than hold them accountable. The military aspects of the investigation attracted particular interest from defense committees concerned about when and how military intelligence could be used for domestic law enforcement purposes. Colonel Webb provided classified briefings explaining the legal frameworks that authorized Operation Blind Justice, emphasizing that military involvement had been triggered by the scale of civil rights violations rather than routine criminal conduct. As evidence continued accumulating, prosecutors prepared charging documents that would ultimately involve 47 defendants across 6 states, including 8 federal judges, 19 law enforcement agents, and 12 prosecutors. The charges ranged from conspiracy and fraud to civil rights violations and money laundering, with potential sentences totaling hundreds of years if all defendants were convicted on all counts. 18 months after the dramatic arrest in Atlanta's federal courthouse, Captain Maya Richardson stood at a podium in the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, addressing an auditorium filled with military intelligence officers, FBI agents, and Justice Department prosecutors. The Conference on Institutional Corruption and Civil Rights Enforcement had drawn participants from across the federal government, all seeking to understand lessons from Operation Blind Justice and how similar investigative approaches might be applied to other systematic abuses of authority. Maya had been promoted to major following the operation's success, and her expertise in the intersection of military intelligence and civilian law enforcement had made her one of the most sought-after speakers on corruption investigations. The case had transformed her from an unknown special operation officer to a recognized authority whose testimony had influenced policy reforms at the highest levels of government. The prosecutions stemming from Operation Blind Justice had concluded with historic results. Judge Harold Brennan received a 28-year federal prison sentence after being convicted on 17 counts, including conspiracy, wire fraud, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. His appeals had been unanimously rejected by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which issued a scathing opinion describing his conduct as a betrayal of the judicial oath that struck at the foundation of constitutional government. Agent Dennis Crawford accepted a plea agreement that resulted in a 19-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation in prosecuting other network members. His testimony had been crucial in securing convictions of judges and prosecutors who might otherwise have claimed they were deceived by a rogue agent. Crawford's cooperation came only after prosecutors made clear that without a plea agreement, he faced potential life imprisonment on charges that included racketeering and money laundering in addition to his evidence fabrication crimes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Dalton received a 12-year sentence, his cooperation and expressions of remorse earning him consideration that the court balanced against the serious nature of his betrayal of prosecutorial ethics. His disbarment proceedings had been swift and unanimous, with the State Bar Association issuing opinions that would be cited in legal ethics courses for decades as examples of how ambition and institutional pressure could corrupt even initially well-intentioned attorneys. The broader network's prosecution had resulted in 41 convictions out of 47 defendants charged. The remaining 6 defendants had died before trial or been deemed incompetent to stand trial due to medical conditions. The collective sentences totaled over 600 years of imprisonment, sending unmistakable messages about consequences for corruption that exploited racial bias and economic inequality.
Financial restitution had been substantial, though incomplete. Prosecutors recovered approximately $38 million through asset forfeitures against the corrupt officials themselves, seizure of proceeds hidden in offshore accounts, and settlements with financial institutions that had facilitated money laundering. These recovered funds were distributed to victims through a claims process administered by a special master appointed by the federal court. The Henderson family received full restitution for their seized businesses, plus compensation for lost profits during the months their operations had been suspended. Thomas and Patricia Henderson had reopened all 11 of their check-cashing locations and had expanded to include financial literacy programs that helped community members understand their rights when dealing with law enforcement or government agencies. Their employees had been rehired with back pay, and the businesses were thriving again, serving as symbols of resilience against official corruption. Beyond individual prosecutions and financial recoveries, Operation Blind Justice had catalyzed systematic reforms in how federal asset forfeiture operated and how judicial conduct was monitored. Congress had passed the Federal Asset Forfeiture Accountability Act, requiring detailed public reporting of all seizure cases, mandatory statistical analysis to identify bias patterns, and establishment of independent review boards with authority to investigate suspicious patterns without requiring permission from judges or law enforcement agencies being scrutinized. The legislation had faced fierce opposition from law enforcement organizations that argued it would hamper legitimate investigations, and from some judges who claimed it infringed on judicial independence. But public outrage over the corruption revelations, combined with bipartisan recognition that the existing system had failed catastrophically, had overcome that resistance. The President signed the bill in a ceremony at the White House, where the Henderson family stood alongside Maya as witnesses to the change their case had prompted. The Federal Judicial Conduct Review Commission had been established as an independent agency with power to investigate judges based on statistical analysis of their decisions, complaints from attorneys or litigants, or referrals from other government agencies. The Commission's first annual report identified 12 additional federal judges whose asset forfeiture decision patterns suggested potential bias, requiring investigation. Several of those judges had taken early retirement rather than face scrutiny, while others were cooperating with reviews that would determine whether their patterns reflected corruption or simply poor judgment that required additional training. Law schools across the country had integrated Operation Blind Justice into their curriculum as a case study in institutional failure and reform.
Students analyzed how corruption had flourished despite existing oversight mechanisms, debated the proper role of military intelligence in domestic law enforcement, and examined ethical obligations of attorneys who witnessed misconduct by colleagues or judges. The case had become required reading in courses on professional responsibility, civil rights litigation, and criminal procedure. Maya's role in the case had inspired significant increases in applications to military intelligence and special operations programs from candidates interested in investigations that combined tactical expertise with legal analysis. The Army had responded by creating specialized tracks for officers with legal training who wanted to focus on operations requiring sophisticated understanding of civilian legal systems. Maya herself had been selected to help design these training programs, ensuring that future operators would be prepared for complex missions at the intersection of military and civilian authority. Chief Judge Patricia Holloway had assumed senior status on the federal bench, reducing her caseload while remaining available to handle complex cases requiring experienced judgment. She had testified extensively before congressional committees about judicial governance reforms and had become an advocate for transparency measures that some of her colleagues found uncomfortable. Her willingness to acknowledge institutional failures and advocate for meaningful change had earned her respect beyond legal circles, with civil rights organizations recognizing her as an example of how people within broken systems could become agents of reform rather than defenders of the status quo. The broader impact on law enforcement culture was harder to measure, but potentially more significant than individual prosecutions or legislative reforms. Federal agents across multiple agencies had received new training, emphasizing ethical obligations to report misconduct by colleagues and protections for whistleblowers who came forward with corruption allegations. The DEA had conducted comprehensive reviews of its field offices, identifying supervisors whose management styles had enabled corrupt agents to operate without adequate oversight. Communities that had been targeted by the corrupt asset forfeiture network were experiencing tentative restoration of trust in federal institutions, though the process remained fragile and incomplete. Community organizations in Atlanta, Birmingham, Charlotte, and other affected cities had established legal aid clinics that helped business owners understand their rights and provided representation in forfeiture proceedings. These clinics operated with funding from settlements paid by institutions that had enabled the corruption, creating lasting infrastructure to prevent future abuses. Thomas Henderson had become an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at universities and community centers about his family's experience and the broader implications of systematic corruption. His message emphasized that individual bad actors were symptoms of institutional problems that required structural solutions rather than simply prosecuting people after they were caught. He had formed friendships with other victims of the network, creating a support community that helped people rebuild their lives and their businesses after official corruption had devastated them. Patricia Henderson had returned to school to pursue a law degree, motivated by her family's experience to help others navigate legal systems that could seem deliberately designed to defeat people without resources or expertise. Her acceptance to Emory Law School had been accompanied by scholarship support from organizations that valued her perspective and commitment to justice. She planned to focus her legal career on civil rights and government accountability, carrying forward the lessons learned from her family's ordeal. Maya concluded her presentation at Fort Bragg with reflections on what Operation Blind Justice had taught about the relationship between individual courage and systemic change. One person standing up against injustice rarely transforms broken systems alone, she told the assembled officers and agents. But one person with evidence, authority, and willingness to act can catalyze processes that force institutions to confront their own failures. Our job as investigators is to create those catalytic moments while building cases strong enough to survive the institutional resistance that inevitably follows. The standing ovation she received reflected not just appreciation for her operational success, but recognition that she represented a model of service that went beyond military objectives to defend constitutional principles that gave meaning to those objectives. Her willingness to risk her career and safety to prevent a miscarriage of justice had demonstrated that accountability required people positioned within institutions to recognize when following orders meant enabling injustice. As the conference concluded and participants returned to their agencies, they carried with them evidence that systematic corruption could be exposed and defeated when investigators combined technical expertise with moral courage. Operation Blind Justice had become more than a case study or a historical example. It had become a template for how to confront institutional failures that routine oversight mechanisms were designed to overlook, and a reminder that justice required eternal vigilance from people willing to challenge authority when authority was abused.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.